Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Oh, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues. You're welcome to this live session of the Public Services International. And we're quite delighted to have a panel of very erudite figures and activists, which include Emilia Reyes, Nicoletta Dentico, and Daniel Bertosa. You are all welcome to this. And before going forward, let me say PSI is very happy to be part of this very important summit towards an eco-social transformation of the world, leaving no one behind. Without much ado, I would want to kick off now. I will introduce each of our speakers as I call them forward to present. And I would start with my very dear sister and comrade, Nicoletta Dentico. Nicoletta Dentico is a journalist and a senior policy analyst in global health and development. After directing Médecins Sans Frontières in Italy, she played an active role in the MSF campaign on access to essential medicines. She worked as consultant of the World Health Organization, and she currently leads the Global Health Program for the Society for International Development. Nicoletta is also co-president of the Geneva Global Health Hub, G2H2, a member of the Consortium Against the Commercialization of Health, and the People's Working Group on Multi-Stakeholderism also. You're very much welcome, Nicoletta. It's a pleasure to have you here. So we're looking at quality public services for a better world. And we realize the central role that public services played in ensuring at least a fairer world than what we have since the beginning of the 80s, in the period between World War II and the early 70s. Then governments were at the center of, it was an unambiguous realization and appreciation of the role of government as duty bearers. But a lot of things have changed, and you have written extensively on this, on the impact of philanthrocapitalism and multi-stakeholderism. So the question I'll put before you now is this, that noting that the democratic content of global governance has been hued over these past decades as part of the processes rolling back the sense of primacy of public services up to the 1970s. How do you think that the situation can be reversed to ensure quality public services for a better world are at the center of narratives and at the center of policy formulation? Nicoletta, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so very much, my brother Baba, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you, PSI, for inviting me, and for this important question that you have asked. I think it's really the question, the big question, global governance, I guess. You know, where the situation where we are moving today and how we are projecting for the future. Now, let me start with two events that have happened in Europe, supposedly the place where we have been able to kind of, conceptualize the notion of universal public services with very important institutional and infrastructural setups, and with also a strong political engagement, as you hinted at earlier, Baba, certainly from after the end of the Second World War until the end of the 70s, with a huge popular movements that actually created the infrastructures of the public services through the help of the feminist movement, the trade unions organization. So really nothing that was terribly technical. It was a very political engagement. That is why I'm politically taking Europe with these two events. Let me start with the first event of the last few days. It's an event that has to do with the thorny issue that, as you read my biography, is very important to me, but I think it's really a key symbolic and key political issue certainly during the pandemic, and I'm talking about access to medicines, especially the relationship between governments and the private sector, the big, gigantic, powerful pharma industry. Now, this time we're talking about Ursula von der Leyen and the 1 month that she spent on her iPhone chatting along with the CEO of Pfizer, Alfred Bourla, because she wanted to, of course, negotiate the contract for a massive contract of COVID-19 vaccines. And basically she did, negotiate this contract alone on a smartphone with the CEO of Pfizer, sealing the pact between the government, the commission representing 27 European countries, and the private industry. Of course, this contract is basically all enshrined in these text messages between her and him. It was a communication of the European Commission of 2 days ago that these text messages went completely lost. They are lost now, okay? Unretrievable. And in fact, they were not retrieved, not even when a few months ago, in response to a public access request coming from certain organizations and journalists, the messages were not made available and were never released to the public information, notwithstanding the fact that Ursula von der Leyen paid Pfizer with European taxpayers. And of course, in the past, the EU Ombudsman Emily O'Reilly has accused the European Commission of maladministration because she did not share these messages. Now these messages are officially lost. So is the arrangement of the biggest European deal on contract purchase of a vaccine purchase a private matter of Ursula von der Leyen and her iPhone, or is this a public matter, a government responsibility? Let me also come back as a follow-up of this still kind of European twist for being emotionally submitted to the private sector, that yesterday a statement by the European Commission, once again on the 29th of June, it was also a Twitter message, basically the European Commission happily declared that the support, quote, the support of the industrial partners will be key to reforming the EU pharmaceutical rules to keep the EU at the center of the innovation effort and capable to ensure that patients have access to essential, affordable medicines to all, end of quote. So the idea, once again, is that the pharmaceutical companies are considered indispensable. They are, the one entity supporting, setting the rules of the European Union, which is one of the biggest investors in pharmaceutical purchases and contracts. They consider the pharma industry their best ally. So, I mean, giving you these two episodes that are very top of the news and also very recent, I think we can declare that governments and the governance of at least in the health domain, but I think this is not an exception. I think we are experiencing what Giorgio Agamben in the past mentioned as a state of exception. In a way, governments have lost a sense of themselves. They have lost a sense of their stated and normative responsibilities, and they have we have lost our bearings, our institutional bearings, when governments are dealing with the entities like the private actors, the private players, which are no longer considered for any of the vested interests they have in brokering their solutions to problems, and also their mentality, their cultural posture they have, of course, which is an entrepreneurial, it is a market-focused, market-oriented, market-driven culture through which is the only culture through which they tailor solutions, they formulate proposals for governments. We are in a state of exception. And this is a state of exception that I now mentioned governments, but often I think has proven to be contagious also for several civil society organizations, which do seem to be sort of either out of resignation or out of acquisition of that market-driven culture. They seem to be in a way seconding this idea that the private sector should be so involved in the governance at the global level in not only health, but this also impacts food, finance, environment, I mean, you name it, in all their education, in all different domains. So your question is, how can we reverse this this trend, and how can we go back to a notion, a conviction of the need for public services for a better world? COVID tried to help us very much in this regard. I think COVID-19 was absolutely pedagogical in two ways. On the one hand, it certainly showed the lack of availability and the lack of efficiency of the private sector for its proper ontology when we are confronted with crises, with emergency situations, and with an extraordinary situation that requires a different logic. That requires a logic that does not follow the market. It serves the purpose of human rights, of a people-centered intervention and action. On the other hand, COVID-19 helped us understand the centrality of the public entity, of the public responsibility, and therefore how indispensable public services are. And I think if we need, and as we do need, to reverse the current trend, which is not a destiny, and which, of course, it's up to us activists, entities like trade unions, movements like the feminist movement that is here represented by Emilia, but I also humbly think I represent in my country very much. Social movements and social organizations, it's up to us to revert this trend, because and we are in a moment of opportunity, because of course we see after 2 years of COVID-19 that there is a very strong acceleration to actually reproducing the logics and the pathways and the solutions that we had before COVID, only at a more accelerated speed. So at this moment of what I would call in Gramscian terms, this kind of interregnum moment that we are experiencing, where we have lost the past and we are still conquering the future scenarios. Of course, we see trends that we don't like, but we think that we have an important, a crucial window of opportunity to newly join forces and to build the new that we want to see, and which I think and I hope is still doable. It's still conquerable, although it will not be an easy journey, and it will not certainly be a fast track journey. It's a long political itinerary that requires evidence, which we have. It requires our capacity to transform the evidence we have into a very strong political demand for the public services that we must have if we are projecting ourselves, as the international community is doing, into a future of pandemic events. as we know, the WHO, but also the United Nations Security Council and the discussions of the General Assembly in New York are just discussing about a pandemic future. Pandemic preparedness and response is the topic of the day, is the topic of the year, certainly in 2022. So precisely, if this is the horizon that the international community has in mind, it is clear that it has to be the public responsibility driving the agenda, and it is the public responsibility designing the new public services that we have to introduce for the future, which I think are now different from the ones that we had in the past. I think COVID-19 and all the epidemic and pandemic crises that already exist or have been brewing in the last few years and have never become so popular as COVID-19. I'm thinking, for example, of antimicrobial resistance, but I'm also thinking of cancer. I'm thinking of other, areas of pathogenetic arenas that do exist. If we are to tackle them, we do need the public function to take its responsibility and to secure free public universal services that will be responding to people's needs, and also work on the prevention agenda that certainly is not the interest of the private sector. Prevention has been abandoned in all policies, not just health, in the past, because it doesn't serve the purpose of the market. Prevention is a totally anti-market. It's actually to try and prevent disasters from happening. And therefore, the public services that we have to create for the future need to integrate this element of prevention, need to integrate also the new categories of that COVID has taught us, not just considering, in silos, health, education, food, finance. We need to really create the nexus, work at the nexus, and create a narrative of the nexus, develop this nexus, which will mean that personnel will have to be trained differently. Investments will have to be much higher. And as we see, for example, at the level of the nexus between food and health, investing in preventing diseases and investing in the right food with a public, it's a public responsibility engagement requires less costs for the government than it does if we just follow the market-driven agenda that the private sector pushes strongly and basically, every time prepares for governments to buy and to take without any hesitation. I think it is possible to reverse this trend. Another global governance is not only possible, but it is very necessary, absolutely indispensable for the future. And the way to do this is to really go back to discuss, to repoliticize health in the domain of health, to repoliticize the agenda, to get over this tide of techno-solutionism that the private sector, the corporate sector, with its philanthropic, philanthrocapitalistic leg is always proposing to us, and also unite social movements across specific and individual agendas to recreate at the international, but also very much at the national level, a very strong political demand for those public services that not only incorporate and interpret the public responsibility that governments have as duty bearers, but also which are the only ones allowing participation, democratic engagement, and the capability of the peoples, the public societies, to be relevant and to be really involved in the design and the implementation of these public policies. Otherwise, we will only be one of the multi-stakeholders involved. And by the way, the least powerful, the least supported, and what I generally call the kind of recitative stakeholder, the decorative stakeholder that no one really cares for, if not for legitimizing these processes of multi-stakeholder governance that don't work and will certainly not be suited to promise to keep the promises that they project for the future. So create a political demand, unite forces for this demand, and speak to societies. I have a final word of caution. Civil society movements like ours should stop speaking to their echo chambers. We need to speak to societies. We need to find the narratives to speak to those that at the moment don't see the need for this political demand creation, and to really be able through the media, through our actions, through our plan of work for the future, for the very imminent future, to engage societies and make them understand how indispensable these public services are for the good fabric of society and for a good social pact, social compact between governments, decision makers, and their people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for that, Nicolette. I really appreciate that. And from even what you started from, I think it says a lot about how the profit interests of corporations have been more dominant in a sense with regards to the COVID pandemic response as against some necessary steps to curtail, to put people unambiguously before profit. Thank you very much for this. And these are important points of how to also change the narrative globally, to put the public once more centrally as the driving force for ensuring the better world that we need. And one of the ways in which public-private partnership and multi-stakeholderism works against publics is by draining resources from public purses. So I'm very happy to have my very good brother and friend and colleague. I know he's had a very busy day already with us, and I'm talking of no other person than Daniel Bertosa. Daniel Bertosa is the Assistant General Secretary at PSI, where he manages policy, advocacy, and governance. He leads the PSI's economic policy work in trade, tax, debts, and the future of quality public services. Danny is also currently the co-chair of the steering committee of the Independent Commission on Reform of International Corporate Tax, ICRIT. He's a member of the Global Reporting Initiative's GRI, Tax Technical Committee, a member of the Center for Research on Employment and Work on the advisory board at the University of Greenwich, and a member of the committee of the Center for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research. So Danny, we often hear the argument that there just simply isn't enough money in the public coffers to fund universal access to quality public services. Although sometimes the magic money tree seems to just appear out of nowhere when it suits the interest of even corporations masquerading as friends, or when you have shocks like the early days of the pandemic. Do you think this is true? And if not, how do you think quality public services for all and for a better world could be funded? Danny, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Comrade Baba, and thanks for the invite. I think the question is one that absolutely needs to be answered. But before I do, I want to talk a little bit about the premise of the question. And there's a little bit of a trap in there. It almost assumes that, or it certainly reinforces that this idea that public sector work or activity is somehow a drag on the economy. And that, you know, we have this dichotomy where we have the private sector that creates value, and then, you know, we have these choices to make about how much of that wealth we use to provide public services, and that somehow the public sector is a drag, and therefore we don't always have enough. There's things we'd like to do, but we don't always have enough. And I think we need to be much bolder and say the public sector and public services, they're an investment. They add value. And in particular, in health, the UN COMHEG panel, which is the Committee on Health, Employment and Economic Growth, it said that the multiplier for health spending was somewhere between 1.8 and 8. Now, what that means is that there is for every dollar that you spend or euro that you spend on health, you get more economic benefit out of it, and it's somewhere between 80% and 800%. And what this means is this is a massively productive area of our economy, and we should be promoting it as such. And the economic downturn from COVID and then the financial crisis showed us that health protects us from economic downturns. If where we had better health systems, where we had less inequality, we've had smaller scars on our economy. And so not only does health spending and quality public healthcare create value and create economic development, it also is a buffer against these shocks and downturns, particularly from pandemics. And then finally, public services, they don't pollute. They generally don't cause harm, and that's got to be taken into account as well. They are a much more socially useful way of producing economic activity. But if the question is, do we have enough money? The first point has got to be, are we collecting enough now? And actually, we're collecting quite a bit, but a lot of the money that we collect is being bled out of public funds away to corporations and corporate profit that could otherwise be used to fund public healthcare. And the first one is the fact that we are overpaying for so many pharmaceutical products because of the way in which the big pharma has managed to convince us through the TRIPS provisions in the World Trade Organization and through a lot of implementation through national legislation that they should have monopoly rights on a whole range of pharmaceutical patents. And the effect of that is that it just drives up the cost of these pharmaceutical goods that the public healthcare system then has to pay, and that profit then goes off to their shareholders and to their management in bonuses and so on. So if we stopped some of the bleeding of that money into the pockets of big pharma, then we'd have more to spend on the healthcare. There are other ways in which we're bleeding as well. The ISDS system, the investor state dispute system, which is set up in our trade agreements to allow private corporations to sue governments if government takes a democratic measure that affects their profits, is a right that corporations have to sue governments for lost profits and future expected profits that nobody else has. And we've seen huge cases where governments have had to pay out taxpayer money to settle these court cases against private corporations for taking democratic actions, often in the public interest. And if we stop that, then there'll be a lot more money to be spent on public healthcare as well. And then the last area where we're seeing a big bleed is privatization. Most privatized services are less efficient, certainly in healthcare, and are more expensive over the long term. And PPPs are no different. We often get a big bump in initial investment. Politicians get to open a new hospital or they get to open a new highway, but we pay a lot more for these public services when they're privatized or through PPPs over the decades. And if we just kept them in-house, even if we'd borrowed or raised revenue or used the revenue we've got, we would then, it would be more sustainable, because in the long term, we would be bleeding less of this money out into corporations. But if the question is, could we raise more, then the answer is very, very simple, and we could. What we need, though, is the political will to do it. It's not really a technical question. We've got lots of answers technically. We know there are very high levels of inequality between countries and increasingly within countries, and this enormous wealth that is being accumulated by these elites and these corporations could be put to better use. we have over 2,000 billionaires in the world. This is an extraordinary amount of wealth. We used to talk about millionaires, but we're now talking about billionaires, and then we have 2,000 of them. And they've, between them, managed to stash into tax havens about 30 trillion US dollars, and about 10 trillion of that comes from the global south. So we have never been wealthier. So there is certainly ways that we can tax that wealth and pay for our public services that really won't cause any dent in the wealth of these people or stifle economic growth in any way. And as you said, COVID showed us that we have lots of money readily available when governments need it, and a lot of that money has been given to employers to keep the private sector afloat. So it turns out that when you have a global financial crisis and you need to save banks, or when you have a COVID shutdown and you need to save the private sector, that money appears to do that. So I think that politically that's absolutely essential that we remember that, because that money is there. The question is, who's it used for? Who's it taken from? And in whose benefits is it used? We know, for example, that many massive corporations pay almost none. The average tax rate for the large digital corporations at the moment is about 7 or 8%. We have nurses doing night shifts in emergency wards in the middle of COVID who are paying 20 and 30 and 40% on their shift penalties, and yet these massive digital corporations pay 7 or 8%. And we can get it. It's not hard to get. We've got a global minimum tax. It's been admitted now that the OECD's done it. We need to have it up at 25% at least, and not 15%. We need to make sure it's distributed out to where the economic activity takes place. And that means not just the rich countries, but where the workers are. We need windfall profit tax, and we need to start taxing wealth. And because if we don't force the wealthy and the corporations to pay that tax, if we get public services, the burden of that tax will fall on workers through payroll tax, and it will also fall on consumers and these are the most regressive taxes. I'll finish up. I just want to say one last thing, and that is debt is also important, and it will likely become more so. It's likely to eat up more and more public revenue. We need to avoid this. We're seeing it already in Sri Lanka. But Sri Lanka might just be the canary in the coal mine. We have the highest levels of sovereign debt ever, and it's rising. Interest rates are beginning to go up, and inflation is going up. We will see more defaults on these debts, and we must have a sovereign debt workout mechanism to ensure that the private banks who are lending money share in the burden, and it's not the population that are forced to deal with the austerity measures that are enforced upon them when the bankers make off with the money after there is a default. Nicoletta said one thing, and that is that we need to stop speaking to the echo chamber. We need to get out and speak to the public. We need to make sure the public hold governments to account. I couldn't agree more on that. No matter what the issue is, whether it's debt, tax, public health, we need to start speaking to the population, and trade unions play a very important role in that. Thanks a lot, Baba.
Thank you very much, Danny. Yeah, as you noted, I partially played the role of a devil's advocate. But yes, it was also to drive home that fact. And as you highlighted, never before has it been so important to hold governments to account. And we appreciate the role of PSI, in which someone like you has been playing a leading role in doing it, of showing the connections between trade, tax, and the need for public services, particularly with the tax, the struggle for the TRIPS waiver, and which also how it has gone now shows some of what Nicoletta has pointed out of how the corporations hold on governments is very unfortunate, and we need to price this open. Thank you once again. And now, the last but definitely not the least, in fact, for me, a very important aspect of this would be taken up by Emilia Reyes. Emilia is a feminist climate activist and the program director of policies and budgets for Equality and Sustainability at Equidad do Género, Ciudadanía, Trabalho y Familia, Gender Equity, Citizenship, Work and Family, which is a feminist Mexican NGO. From 2014 to 2019, Emilia was one of the 8 organizing partners of the Women's Major Group for the 2030 Agenda. And from 2017 to 2019, she was co-chair of the United Nations High-Level Political Forum Major Groups and Other Stakeholders Coordination Mechanism. And since 2017, she has been a co-convener of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. We're very happy to have you here, Emilia. And this last question addresses a very important intersection between gender and care, because we have seen the commodification of care with the so-called care economy. But one of the things the pandemic has shown is the centrality of public care. So my question to you, without much ado, is this, Emilia. Women are no doubt most impacted in several ways by the lack of universal access to quality public services. Meanwhile, they play key roles in the health and social care sector. Over the past 2 years, PSI and several other feminist civil society organizations have called for a social reorganization of care to address some important aspects of this impact. How do you think that this process could be deepened? Emilia, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me. It is an honor for me to be here with all of you. I'm actually in Geneva attending the international conference with feminist economists, and we are gathered here for 2 days to discuss all of these pressing issues that you're mentioning. And I was also just kicked out of our room, so I had to leave, and I'm in a hallway, so I hope everybody can listen. These are the perks of working and traveling. But I just wanted to highlight first, before going into the feminist agenda, that I'm really appreciating what my other co-panelists said. I just want to add a new layer of challenge, which is that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just released a report, just a series of reports actually in the past months. The most concerning figure we have is that we have 3 years to change the system, because we can only keep on emitting greenhouse emissions up to 2025, and then we need to fall dramatically, 43% of those emissions until 2030, if we want to remain below 1.5 degrees. And that is a very stark figure, because what we're talking in this panel about the centrality of public services is at the core of the solutions that we have, because we cannot keep on relying on profiting from the planet, the extraction of resources, the exploitation of ecosystems, but also because the human consumption and production is, of course, relying on the privatization of everything that relates to human life and care and the protection of life beyond the human race. So going back to the commons, including public services, is key to maintain within a decent life, within the principles of human rights, and at the same time, a key component of a different way to engaging with our planet and to our economic systems. So, as I said, we only have 3 years to shift towards an entire different economic paradigm that is away from the priorities of these capitalistic systems that values more the financial flows, the transaction of goods and commodities above the well-being of people and the health of this planet. So just wanted to state that. And to me, this is something that is really important, because I think in a meeting such as this one, we really need to reassess all of our strategies, all of our messaging around the emergency that is not only posed against life for human beings, but life in itself in this planet. And I just want to highlight that after the IPCC report was launched, a series of other scientific papers were released. They called amongst themselves, the scientists, the apocalypse papers, because they refer to a series of elements that are contained within the planetary boundaries. And all of these components, once you overshoot them, then you go above these planetary boundaries. There are 9 of them, and it seems that we have already overshoot 4 of them. Climate change is one, biodiversity and integrity is another one. Land use is another one. And actually, there is another one that we're almost about to overshoot as well, which is ocean acidification. So just to say that even if we were to stop climate change tomorrow, we would still have all of those pressing issues on our environment that relate to the way we produce, that we engage, that we extract, not as personally the system, in a manner that some scenarios are saying that the human extinction is coming in 2040. It is that dire, it is that bad, it is that urgent, and it should be a wake-up call for all of us, because at the center of our analysis, of course, it is that the ways of production and consumption cannot keep on the way that they are, that the labor agenda is at the core of the shifts that we need in this world, because they're related to the the extractive practices of this system. And of course, the trade unions movement have been at the forefront defending a new paradigm in accordance to a just transition. But in a broader sense, I think it is a matter as well to think, in the middle of all of these crises that Nicoleta and Daniel were highlighting about, whether are we in a condition to see each other collectively in the middle of a pandemic that is still going on. I'm scared of being in Geneva and seeing that people here talk about the pandemic as if it were in the past. They are not wearing masks because there is access to medication here, whereas in the global south, we don't even have access to medication. So it is really concerning. But they also talk about the environmental crisis and climate change as if it were something about the future. So I just really want to bring again another political issue, which is the differentiation of measures and the differentiation of our political analysis. We need now the global north actors to take hold of the responsibility that it lies within their territories, because it is the overshoot of emissions, but as well as material resource use and exploitation of the global south, the one that is driving the loss of life as we know it. So to me, this is a call for us as social movements to do a mapping of what are we doing, of reassessing our strategies, and thinking that in a dire moment, as in the middle of the pandemic, the debt crisis, etc., without fiscal justice, we still need to gather up and find collective strategies. And I say we cannot keep on relying on the global south to put off the dead bodies, to put all the people in jail and thinking that the global south is gonna rise up and win the global struggle. Because if we don't have any real mobilization in the global north, if we don't have a real citizen engagement in the global north with their governments, with their decision makers, then there is not going to be any solution. We've seen how at the WTO, at the OECD, at the Paris Club, at the G7, at the G20, they're undermining in an undemocratic manner all of the possible ways that we have for global transformation. And this is where our feminist agenda comes. I just needed to put that there, because it seems like even the solutions are still relying on the exploitation of women and the extraction of their labor, so that we can continue to appear as we are transiting through a crisis, but in reality, we're exploiting and oppressing women who are the ones who are upholding life and the everyday activities of humans. And so I have here as a background the value that is added by unpaid domestic and care work by women in economies. All of the segments in yellow are that value produced by women. And this is just the segment of monetized economy, what the economists called the economy, right? But the feminists, we know it's all of these, and it's also not only supporting economy, but it's also upholding life and our engagement with this planet. So the solutions that we hear, even from the just transition of the labor force, are still male dominated, and they are not including a feminist perspective in bearing into account the sexual division of labor. So this means that we're still feminizing care and leaving women in the domestic space, and all of the transition for labor, for new jobs, etc., will happen in the sectors that produce the environmental emergencies, and will shift men from one sector that has been, let us say, polluting to another that is clean, and women will still remain in the subsidizing field. And we see the same with all of these proposals on Green New Deals, etc. So I don't have enough time to address this, how also with the pandemics, we've seen a regression of 20 years in women's human rights. But at the same time, I just want to highlight before closing that gender equality is a macro challenge that requires macro solutions. And it relates to all of these issues that have been discussed here. And we really need to engage in a broader analysis about the global economic and financial architecture. And of course, the labor movements are at the forefront of the actors who need to help promote a new mobilization globally. And to my eyes, it has to be differentiated. The global north needs to take the lead, needs to be more bold, more aggressive. To my eyes as well, they need to start burning their political capital. We cannot keep on acting in the same way. So it is a really urgent call. As we all know here, the money is there, the actions are there, the ideas for real solutions are there. Public services are at the core of what we need if we want to transit from one model of life that privileges profit over care and life, but we have to act fast. So I know we don't have much time, so I'm gonna leave it there. I'm very happy to engage with all of you for the continuing strategizing. Thank you.
Thank you immensely, Emilia, for that brilliant presentation. I mean, that ecofeminist perspective, it highlighted quite a number of things, some of which at times could be taken for granted. First and foremost is that we need the continued existence of the world for it to be better. And the forces undermining having a better world are not just undermining having a better world, but are undermining the continued existence of the world. And I very much appreciate this. And due to the time, there are a few questions which I will respond to on the YouTube. We want to thank all those that have joined us on the YouTube. And I want to very much express our appreciation to you, Emilia, to you, my co-commandante, Nicoletta, and to my comrade and brother from another mother, Daniel. It's a pleasure. And thank you all. And yes, also we use this opportunity to say a big thank you to the Secretariat of the Global Summit. They've been working around the clock this past couple of days, and we are happy to have been part of this Amantla away too. Thank you. Bye.